Sometimes the greatest love comes from the most unexpected places. When a child loses everything that matters, they'll do anything to fill the emptiness in their heart. 9-year-old Brigid O'Malley had been alone for 2 long years since her mother passed away, living with her father Seamus in the snowy mountains of Pine Ridge. She spent her days dreaming of having a friend who would never leave her side. Then, one winter day, a strange auction came to town. Among the animals for sale was the biggest wolf anyone had ever seen. It was white as snow with glowing amber eyes that seemed almost human. When Brigid looked at this magnificent creature, something magical happened. The wolf looked back at her, and she knew they belonged together. Her father let her bid on the wolf, and somehow she won. But what nobody knew was that this wasn't just any ordinary animal. What ancient secret was this mysterious wolf hiding? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The weathered auction flyer had been pinned to the community board outside Flanagan's general store for 3 days before anyone paid it much attention. Most folks in Pine Ridge were too busy preparing for another harsh mountain winter to concern themselves with exotic animal auctions. But 9-year-old Brigid O'Malley had memorized every word on that crumpled piece of paper. She pressed her nose against the frost-covered window of the store, her breath creating small clouds on the glass as she read the notice for the 100th time. "Rare and exotic animals from around the world," it proclaimed in bold letters that had faded from repeated handling. Below that, a list of creatures that seemed more fitting for a fairy tale than their quiet Colorado mountain town. Siberian tigers, African lions, Argentine condors, and at the very bottom, almost as an afterthought, one Arctic wolf, male, approximately 200 pounds. Brigid's heart had stopped when she first read those words. An Arctic wolf, here in Pine Ridge. It seemed impossible, like something from one of the stories her mother used to tell her before bedtime, back when bedtime stories still existed. In the O'Malley household, the bell above the shop door chimed as old Mrs. Flanagan emerged, wrapping a thick wool shawl around her shoulders. "Still dreaming about that auction, are you, child?" she asked, her Irish accent thick as the morning fog that often settled in their valley. Catherine Flanagan had known Brigid since birth, had held her as a baby when her mother Moira brought her to the store for the first time. That was before the cancer, before the long nights at the hospital, before their world became a place of hushed conversations and empty spaces. "Mrs. Flanagan," Brigid said, turning from the window, "do you think it's real? The wolf, I mean." The older woman studied the child's face, noting the hope that flickered in her green eyes so much like her mother's it made Catherine's chest ache. Brigid had grown thin over the past 2 years, not from lack of food, but from lack of joy. Her father Seamus did his best, but a man who spent his days hammering iron in the forge wasn't naturally equipped to heal a little girl's broken heart. "I've lived in these mountains for 73 years, Brigid O'Malley," Catherine said, adjusting her shawl against the December wind. "I've seen stranger things than wolves in cages come through Pine Ridge. But I'll tell you this, sometimes what we need most has a way of finding us, even when we least expect it." The walk home took Brigid along the winding gravel road that connected the town's main street to the scattered homes on the mountainside. Pine Ridge wasn't much to look at. A post office, the general store, Murphy's Tavern, the small Catholic church where Father Murphy had said her mother's funeral mass, Dr. Kennedy's clinic, and the school where 23 children from kindergarten through 8th grade learned their lessons in 3 cramped rooms. But it was home, the only home Brigid had ever known. The O'Malley cottage sat at the end of Maple Lane, a modest 2-bedroom house with a stone chimney that Seamus had built himself, and a front porch where Moira used to sit and shell peas in the summer evenings. Behind the house stood Seamus's forge, a sturdy building where he crafted horseshoes, fence posts and farm tools for the ranchers in the surrounding valleys. The steady ring of his hammer against the anvil had been the soundtrack of Brigid's childhood as constant and comforting as her own heartbeat, but today the forge was silent. Through the kitchen window, Brigid could see her father sitting at their small dining table, staring at a stack of bills with the same expression he'd worn at her mother's bedside during those final weeks. Seamus O'Malley was a big man, broad-shouldered and strong from years of physical labor, but grief had a way of making even giants look fragile. "Da?" Brigid called as she entered through the back door, hanging her coat on one of the wooden pegs Seamus had carved and mounted beside the entrance. The kitchen still smelled faintly of the oatmeal they'd shared for breakfast, though neither of them had eaten much. Meals had become perfunctory affairs since Moira's passing, necessary fuel rather than the warm family gatherings they'd once been. "How was school, love?" Seamus asked, looking up from the bills with effort. His dark hair, once thick and unruly like Brigid's own, now showed threads of premature grey at the temples. His hands, calloused from the forge, bore small burns and nicks, the inevitable marks of his trade. "Fine," Brigid said, though it hadn't been fine at all. School meant sitting alone at lunch while the other children clustered in their established groups, meant watching from the sidelines during recess games, meant being the object of sympathetic glances from her teacher, Miss O'Brien, who tried too hard to include her in activities. It meant being the girl whose mother died, the one everyone felt sorry for, but nobody quite knew how to approach. She pulled out the chair across from her father and sat down, folding her hands on the table the way her mother had taught her. "Da, there's going to be an auction on Saturday at the old fairgrounds." Seamus set down the electric bill he'd been studying and gave his daughter his full attention. This was more than she'd said about any upcoming event in months. "What kind of auction?" "Animals, exotic animals from around the world." The words tumbled out of her in a rush. "There's a wolf, Da, a real wolf. Mrs. Flanagan thinks it might be meant to be. Things finding us when we need them most." The hope in her voice was both heartbreaking and dangerous. Seamus had spent 2 years watching his daughter withdraw into herself, had seen her transform from a chattering, energetic child who filled their home with laughter into a quiet ghost who moved through their days like she was afraid of taking up too much space. The few times she'd shown genuine enthusiasm for anything, it had ended in disappointment. The puppy at the animal shelter that was adopted before they could return the next day. The school play she'd wanted to try out for, but lost her nerve at the last moment. "A wolf, Brigid?" he said gently. "Wolves are wild animals, love. They're not meant to be pets. But this one is different, Da. I can feel it." She reached across the table and touched his work-roughened hand with her small fingers. "Please, just come look at it with me. We don't have to bid on anything. We could just go and see." Seamus studied his daughter's face, seeing Moira's determined chin and stubborn streak in the set of her jaw. His wife had possessed the same ability to make impossible things seem reasonable through sheer force of will. It was how she'd convinced him to leave Boston 20 years ago and move to this remote mountain town where they'd built their life. Together, the memory of Moira was everywhere in their small home. Her favorite coffee mug still sat in the kitchen cupboard, unwashed since the morning she'd gone to the hospital for the last time. Her books lined the shelves in the living room, their margins filled with her careful handwriting. The garden she tended so lovingly behind the house stood dormant now under 2 feet of snow, but come spring, Seamus knew her perennial flowers would push through the earth as if she'd never left them. "The auction is Saturday?" he asked. Brigid nodded, not trusting herself to speak, for fear he might change his mind. "And you just want to look?" Another nod, though they both knew it was unlikely to end there. Seamus sighed, feeling the weight of single parenthood settle on his shoulders once again. Every decision felt monumental when there was no partner to share the responsibility, no one else to blame if things went wrong. But the spark in Brigid's eyes was the first sign of life he'd seen from her in months. "All right," he said finally, "we'll go have a look. But Brigid, love, I need you to understand that even if this wolf is everything you're hoping for, we might not be able to afford—" "I know, Da," she interrupted, but she was already imagining walking through the snow with a magnificent white wolf at her side, having a friend who would listen to her stories and never judge her for being different, for being sad, for missing her mother so desperately that sometimes she couldn't breathe. That night, as Brigid lay in her narrow bed under the quilt her grandmother had sewn, she stared at the ceiling and let herself dream. In her mind, the wolf from the auction flyer wasn't just any wolf. It was special, magical, sent specifically for her. It had intelligent eyes that understood her loneliness and a gentle heart that could somehow fill the terrible emptiness her mother's death had left behind. She reached under her pillow and pulled out her mother's silver locket, the one thing of Moira's that Seamus had given her to keep. Inside was a tiny photograph of their family taken 3 years ago at the county fair, back when they'd been whole. But there was something else in the locket, something Brigid had never paid much attention to before, a small Celtic symbol etched into the silver on the back. Intricate knots that seemed to twist and move in the lamplight. Her mother had been proud of their Irish heritage, had filled Brigid's childhood with stories of Celtic warriors and mystical creatures, of a homeland where magic was as real as the morning mist. "We come from a long line of strong women," Moira used to say, "women who understood that there's more to this world than what we can see with our eyes." As Brigid drifted towards sleep, the locket warm in her palm, she could almost hear her mother's voice telling her one of those old stories. In her dreams, the white wolf from the auction was running through an ancient forest, and somehow, impossibly, Brigid was running beside him. 3 more days until Saturday. 3 more days until everything would change. The old fairgrounds hadn't seen this much activity since the county fair 5 years ago. Temporary pens and cages dotted the snow-covered field like a bizarre winter carnival, each enclosure holding creatures that seemed to have wandered out of a National Geographic documentary. The auction company had arrived before dawn. There, trucks and trailers creating a small city of canvas walls and generator-powered lights. Brigid pressed close to her father's side as they approached the entrance, her heart hammering against her ribs with anticipation and fear. She'd barely slept the night before and had been too nervous to eat more than a few bites of toast at breakfast. Seamus kept one protective hand on her shoulder as they navigated through the growing crowd of curious onlookers. The people of Pine Ridge had turned out in surprising numbers. Ranch families who rarely came to town for anything but supplies stood alongside elderly couples who'd driven down from their mountain cabins. Even Father Murphy was there, his usually severe expression softened by wonder as he watched a pair of snow leopards pace gracefully in their enclosure. "Look at the size of that thing," someone whispered, and Brigid knew without turning that they'd found the wolf's cage. It sat apart from the other enclosures, surrounded by yellow caution tape and warning signs. The cage itself was industrial strength, steel built to contain something far more dangerous than any ordinary animal. But it was the creature inside that made Brigid's breath catch in her throat. The wolf was even more magnificent than she'd imagined. He stood nearly 4 feet tall at the shoulder, with a coat so purely white it seemed to glow against the grey morning sky. His build was massive, easily the 200 pounds advertised, but there was nothing clumsy or brutish about him. Every line of his body spoke of power held in perfect balance, of intelligence and dignity that transcended his captivity. But it was his eyes that stopped her heart. They were amber, like liquid gold, and when his gaze found hers across the 20 feet that separated them, Brigid felt something shift in the world around her. Time seemed to slow, the voices of the crowd fading to a distant murmur. The wolf's eyes held hers with an intensity that was almost human, and in that moment she understood with absolute certainty that this creature was meant to be hers. "Magnificent, isn't he?" a voice said beside them. Brigid turned to see a thin man in an expensive coat, his pale eyes studying her reaction with interest. That's the prize of our collection, captured in the Siberian wilderness just 3 months ago. They say his pack was legendary among the local tribes, wolves that could speak with spirits, that could call storms and calm the wildest beasts. Seamus frowned at the man's theatrical tone. "You're with the auction company?" "Marcus Holloway, lead procurement specialist," the man said, extending a manicured hand. "We've traveled the world to assemble this collection. Each animal has a story, a heritage. But that wolf, he's special. The locals who helped us capture him claimed he was the last of his kind." Brigid stepped closer to the cage, ignoring the warning signs. The wolf remained motionless, watching her approach with those incredible eyes. Around his neck, barely visible through his thick fur, she could see the edge of what looked like an old leather collar. "What's that around his neck?" she asked. Holloway followed her gaze and shrugged. "Some kind of primitive collar. The natives who helped us capture him insisted it stay on. Superstitious nonsense, but we honored their wishes. They seemed genuinely afraid of what might happen if it was removed." The collar was ancient leather, darkened with age and marked with symbols that made Brigid think of the Celtic knots on her mother's locket. As she watched, the wolf moved closer to the bars of his cage, lowering his massive head until he was nearly at her eye level. His amber gaze never wavered from hers. "Easy, boy," Seamus said nervously, stepping forward to pull his daughter back. But the wolf made no threatening moves. Instead, he simply studied Brigid with an expression that seemed almost thoughtful, as if he was trying to communicate something important. "He likes you," Holloway observed. "Interesting. He's been completely hostile to everyone else who's approached his cage. Yesterday, he nearly took the finger off a rancher who got too close." A loudspeaker crackled to life across the fairgrounds. "Ladies and gentlemen, the exotic animal auction will begin in 15 minutes. Please gather around the main platform for registration and bidding procedures." Brigid felt panic rising in her chest. In 15 minutes, someone else might bid. On the wolf. Someone who would take him away, who wouldn't understand how important this moment was, how desperately she needed him. "Da!" she whispered, tugging on Seamus's coat sleeve. "We have to bid on him. Brigid, love, we talked about this. We're here to look, not to buy. We can't afford—" "Please, Da, look at him. Really look at him." Her voice was urgent now, filled with a certainty that surprised even her. "He's supposed to be ours. Can't you feel it?" Seamus looked from his daughter to the wolf, seeing something in both their expressions that made his chest tighten. The wolf's gaze had shifted to him now, and there was something unnervingly intelligent in those amber eyes, something that seemed to be asking a question. "The bidding usually starts around 5,000 for an animal of this caliber," Holloway said conversationally. "Though I suspect he'll go for much more. We've had several serious inquiries from private collectors and wildlife preserves." $5,000. Seamus felt his heart sink. That was more money than he'd made in the past 3 months combined. The forge work had been slow lately, with many of the local ranchers doing their own repairs to save money. Their savings account, what was left of it after Moira's medical bills, held maybe $800. But when he looked at Brigid, saw the desperate hope in her eyes, he found himself walking toward the registration table anyway. His daughter had asked for so little since her mother's death, had been so good, so patient, so heartbreakingly brave as their world fell apart around them. If this wolf could bring even a spark of joy back into her life, how could he deny her? "Sir, you'll need to register as a bidder," the woman behind the table said, handing him a clipboard with forms to fill out. "There's a $50 registration fee and a requirement to show proof of funds for any bid you plan to make." Seamus stared at the forms, calculating rapidly in his head. Even if by some miracle the bidding stayed low, he'd be risking their rent money, their grocery budget, everything they had. "Da!" Brigid's voice was small, uncertain. She'd seen the worry on his face, understood what the woman's words meant. He looked down at his daughter, at this brave little girl who'd lost so much and asked for so little in return. Then he looked back at the wolf, who was still watching them from his cage, with those impossibly intelligent eyes. "We'll register," he told the woman, pulling his wallet from his coat pocket. The auction began with smaller animals, exotic birds, reptiles, a pair of fennec foxes that went for $300 to a wealthy ranch wife from the next county. Brigid and Seamus stood at the back of the crowd, hands clasped tightly together, as lot after lot was sold to bidders with far deeper pockets than theirs. Finally, Holloway led the wolf's cage toward the auction platform. The crowd pressed forward, sensing that this was the main event. The wolf moved with fluid grace despite his confinement, his head held high, his amber eyes scanning the assembled people with what looked like disdain. "Lot number 17, the auctioneer announced. One male Arctic wolf, approximately 4 years old, 200 pounds, in perfect health. Bidding will start at $5,000. Several hands went up immediately. Seamus felt his own hand rise, though he wasn't entirely sure he'd meant to do it. 5,000 to the gentleman. "In the back," the auctioneer called. "Do I hear 6? The bidding climbed quickly. 6,000, 7, 8. Each increase felt like a physical blow to Seamus's chest. At $10,000, he should have stopped. At 12,000, he was risking everything they had and more. But something kept his hand moving, kept him nodding, when the auctioneer looked his way. One by one, the other bidders dropped out. At 15,000, only Seamus and a well-dressed woman near the front were still in the running. The woman looked back at him with obvious annoyance, clearly frustrated by his persistence. 16,000, she called out, not waiting for the auctioneer. The crowd turned to look at Seamus. Brigid squeezed his hand so tightly it hurt. In his peripheral vision, he could see the wolf watching him from his cage, those amber eyes fixed on his face with an expression that seemed almost pleading. 16,000 going once, the auctioneer said. Going twice. Seamus opened his mouth, though he had no idea what he was going to say. They didn't have $16,000. They didn't have half that much. But somehow, impossibly, he found himself nodding. 17,000 to the gentleman in the back. The well-dressed woman threw up her hands in disgust and stalked away from the platform. A few other potential bidders looked at Seamus with newfound respect, clearly assuming he was wealthier than his appearance suggested. 17,000 going once, going twice. Sold to bidder number 47. The crowd burst into applause. Brigid threw her arms around her father's waist, tears streaming down her face. But Seamus felt only a growing sense of panic. $17,000. What had he done? As if reading his thoughts, Holloway appeared at his elbow. "Congratulations," he said smoothly. "That was quite a bidding war. We'll need payment within the hour, of course, cash or certified check." Seamus nodded numbly, his mind racing. He had no idea how he was going to pay for the wolf, but somehow, looking at his daughter's radiant face, he knew he'd find a way. The wolf, now officially theirs, watched them approach his cage with what looked remarkably like satisfaction. As Brigid knelt beside the steel bars, he moved closer, pressing his massive head against the metal so she could touch his fur through the gaps. "Hello, Finn," she whispered, the name coming to her as naturally as breathing. "I'm Brigid. We're going to take you home." The wolf's amber eyes seemed to glow with approval. Around his neck, the ancient leather collar caught the afternoon light, its mysterious symbols gleaming like old gold. The first morning with Finn dawned crisp and clear, painting the mountains in shades of gold and pink that reminded Brigid of the wolf's extraordinary eyes. She'd barely slept, despite her exhaustion from the previous day's events. Every few minutes throughout the night, she'd crept to her bedroom window to peer out at the temporary enclosure Seamus had hastily constructed in their backyard, just to make sure the wolf was really there, that she hadn't dreamed the entire impossible day. Finn was already awake when she looked out, sitting calmly in the center of the enclosure, with his head tilted toward her window, as if he'd been waiting for her to appear. The sight of him, massive and white against the snow, still took her breath away. Her wolf, her companion, the friend she'd been praying for since the day her mother died. Seamus had spent most of the previous evening on the phone with his brother in Denver, arranging an emergency loan that would somehow cover the $17,000 purchase. Price. The conversation had been difficult. Painful questions about his judgment, worried lectures about financial responsibility, reminders that he had a daughter to think about. But in the end, family was family, and the money would be wired to the auction company by noon. "Morning, love," Seamus said as Brigid appeared in the kitchen, already dressed and eager to get outside. He was standing at the stove, scrambling eggs with the careful attention of a man still learning to cook for his family. "Sleep well?" "He was watching my window all night," Brigid said, accepting the plate he offered her. "I think he was making sure I was safe." Seamus smiled despite his lingering worry about their finances. His daughter's face had more color this morning than he'd seen in months, and she was actually eating her breakfast instead of pushing it around her plate. If Finn could work that kind of magic, maybe $17,000 wasn't such an unreasonable price after all. After breakfast, they went outside together to properly introduce themselves to their new family member. Finn rose as they approached, his movements fluid and graceful despite his enormous size. Up close, in the bright morning light, Brigid could see details she'd missed at the auction. The way his fur wasn't purely white, but contained subtle shades of cream and silver, the intelligence that seemed to shine from his amber eyes, the strange symbols carved into his ancient leather collar. "Easy, boy," Seamus said, though his tone was more cautious than afraid. The wolf had shown no aggression the day before, but Seamus was still adjusting to the idea of having a predator in his backyard. "We're going to take good care of you." Finn approached the fence slowly, his gaze shifting between father and daughter. When he reached the spot where Brigid was standing, he lowered his massive head and pressed it against the chain link, allowing her to stroke the thick fur between his ears. The moment her fingers made contact with his fur, Brigid felt something extraordinary happen. A sense of warmth and completeness flowed through her, as if a piece of herself that had been missing since her mother's death had suddenly clicked back into place. Finn's amber eyes half closed in what looked like contentment, and she could swear she felt his emotions as clearly as her own. A deep satisfaction, a sense of homecoming, and underneath it all, an ancient patience, as if he'd been waiting for this moment for far longer than the few months since his capture. "He likes you," Seamus observed, though something in the wolf's behavior puzzled him. Most wild animals, even those raised in captivity, maintained some wariness around humans. Finn seemed not just comfortable, but genuinely happy to be here, as if he'd chosen them, rather than the other way around. Over the next few days, Finn's extraordinary nature became increasingly apparent. When Seamus brought him raw meat from the butcher shop in town, the wolf sniffed it politely, but showed no real interest. Instead, he seemed to prefer the vegetables from their root cellar, potatoes, carrots, even the withered apples from their small orchard. It was unheard of for a carnivore to show such preferences, but Finn appeared healthier and more energetic on his unusual diet than he'd looked in his cage. More startling was his obvious intelligence. Finn learned his name within hours and began responding to simple commands with an understanding that went far beyond typical animal behavior. When Brigid asked him to sit, he sat. When she told him to stay while she went inside for lunch, he remained motionless until she returned. Most remarkably, he seemed to understand not just her words, but her emotions, appearing at her side whenever she felt sad or lonely, offering silent comfort with his warm presence. The school week brought new challenges. Miss O'Brien was understandably concerned when Brigid mentioned their new pet, and several parents called to express worry about having such a large predator in their small community. But when Dr. Kennedy stopped by to examine Finn and declared him healthy and remarkably gentle, some of the fears began to subside. "I've never seen anything quite like it," the elderly physician confided to Seamus as they watched Brigid play with the wolf in the backyard. "That animal's behavior is more like a well-trained dog than a wild wolf. Where did you say the auction company found him?" "Siberia," they claimed. "Some remote wilderness area." Seamus frowned, watching as Finn carefully retrieved a thrown stick, his massive jaws handling the small piece of wood with impossible gentleness. The man running the auction said the locals had stories about his pack, superstitions about wolves that could communicate with spirits. Dr. Kennedy raised an eyebrow. "And what do you think of that?" "I think there's more to Finn than we understand yet," Seamus admitted. "But look at her, Doc. When's the last time you saw Brigid smile like that?" It was true. The change in Brigid was remarkable. She talked more, ate better, and had begun sleeping. Through the night, without the recurring nightmares that had plagued her since Moira's death. At school, she carried herself with a new confidence, telling anyone who would listen about her wonderful wolf. Some of the other children were fascinated, begging for details about Finn's size and habits. A few seemed frightened by the idea. But for the first time in 2 years, Brigid didn't seem to care whether everyone liked her or not. It was while searching the attic for a larger dog bed that might accommodate Finn's impressive size that Brigid made her first real discovery. Behind a stack of old Christmas decorations, she found a trunk she'd never seen before, filled with items that had belonged to her mother's family. Most were typical family treasures, old photographs, letters, a few pieces of costume jewelry. But at the bottom of the trunk, wrapped in tissue paper that crumbled at her touch, she found something extraordinary. The journal was bound in worn leather, its pages yellowed with age. The text was written in 2 languages, English in her great-grandmother's, careful script, and what looked like Gaelic in a different hand entirely. As Brigid carefully turned the fragile pages, her heart began to race. The journal was filled with stories about wolves, not ordinary wolves, but creatures of legend and magic, guardians who had once protected the sacred places of the old world. According to the journal, her great-grandmother Siobhan had been the keeper of ancient knowledge, passed down through generations of Celtic women who understood that the boundary between the natural and supernatural worlds was far thinner than most people believed. On one page, written in English in her great-grandmother's careful hand, Brigid found a passage that made her blood run cold. The guardian wolves were bound to the sacred sites by ancient magic, protectors of the old ways in a world that was forgetting its connection to the mystical. When the last of the sacred places fell to modern progress, the wolves were scattered, their purpose seemingly lost. But the old magic runs deep, and those who carry the bloodline will always recognize their guardians when they meet them. Below the English text, someone had drawn a detailed illustration of a wolf collar, decorated with intricate Celtic knots and symbols. It looked exactly like the ancient leather collar Finn wore around his neck. With trembling hands, Brigid read. Further, the journal spoke of wolves who could live far longer than natural animals, who possessed intelligence that bordered on human reasoning, who could sense the emotions and needs of those they were meant to protect. According to the text, these guardian wolves appeared in times of great need, drawn to members of the ancient bloodlines by forces older than recorded history. As Brigid sat in the dusty attic, surrounded by the remnants of her family's forgotten, past pieces of an impossible puzzle began falling into place. Her mother's stories about Celtic magic and mystical creatures, the way Finn had looked at her during the auction, as if he'd been waiting specifically for her to find him. His unusual intelligence, his vegetarian preferences, his obvious contentment with his new life. The collar around his neck wasn't just a primitive artifact, it was a symbol of his true nature. Proof that Finn wasn't just any wolf, but something far more extraordinary. And if the journal was correct, If her great-grandmother's stories held even a grain of truth, then Brigid herself might be far more than just a lonely little girl who'd gotten lucky at an exotic animal auction. She was part of an ancient lineage, a bloodline that connected her to mysteries older than the mountains that surrounded their small town. And Finn, magnificent, impossible Finn, had somehow found his way to her across continents and centuries, drawn by magic she was only beginning to understand. The implications were both thrilling and terrifying. But as she heard her father calling her name from downstairs, she carefully closed the journal and held it against her chest, feeling the weight of destiny settling around her shoulders like her mother's old shawl. Everything was about to change. Again, the second week with Finn brought revelations that both thrilled and unsettled the O'Malley household. Brigid had taken to carrying her great-grandmother's journal with her everywhere, studying its cryptic passages during lunch breaks at school and by lamplight before bed. The more she read, the more convinced she became that Finn was no ordinary wolf, and that her own family history was far more mysterious than she'd ever imagined. It was during one of these late-night reading sessions that she discovered a reference to the Crystal of Awakening, supposedly a family heirloom that would glow in the presence of guardian magic. Brigid's heart raced as she remembered the box of her mother's jewelry that Seamus had carefully packed away after the funeral, too painful to look at, but too precious to discard. The next morning, while her father worked in the forge, Brigid crept into his bedroom and retrieved the small wooden box from the top shelf of the closet. Her hands trembled as she opened it, breathing in the faint scent of her mother's perfume that still clung to the velvet lining. Most of the jewelry was costume pieces, pretty but inexpensive earrings and bracelets that Moira had collected over the years. But nestled in the corner, wrapped in a piece of soft cloth, Brigid found something that made her gasp aloud. The crystal pendant was roughly the size of a walnut, carved into an intricate Celtic knot that seemed to twist and flow like living water. It hung from a delicate silver chain that had clearly been crafted by skilled hands generations ago. As Brigid lifted it from the box, the crystal caught the morning sunlight streaming through the bedroom window and threw tiny rainbows across the walls. But it wasn't until she walked outside with the pendant that something truly extraordinary happened. The moment she stepped into the backyard where Finn was resting in his enclosure, the crystal began to glow, not with reflected sunlight, but with an inner radiance that pulsed gently like a living heartbeat. Finn's head snapped up immediately, his amber eyes focusing on the pendant with an intensity that made Brigid's breath catch. Slowly, the wolf rose and approached the fence, his gaze fixed on the glowing crystal. When he was close enough, Brigid extended her hand toward him, the pendant dangling from her fingers. The moment it came within a foot of Finn's ancient collar, both artifacts blazed with light so bright that Brigid had to shield her eyes. "What in the name of—" Seamus's voice cut through the morning air as he emerged from the forge, attracted by the unusual glow. He stopped dead when he saw the pendant in his daughter's hand, his face draining of color. "That's your mother's pendant," he said quietly. "I thought we'd lost it years ago." The crystal's glow faded as Brigid pulled her hand back, but Finn remained alert and watchful, his gaze shifting between the pendant and Brigid's face with obvious intelligence. There was something in his expression that reminded her of the way her mother used to look when she was about to share one of her old Irish stories, a mixture of wisdom and barely contained excitement. Look at this," Brigid said, opening the journal to a page she'd bookmarked. Great-grandmother Siobhan wrote about a crystal that would glow in the presence of guardian magic. This has to be it. Seamus approached slowly, his expression troubled. He'd been trying to ignore the growing strangeness surrounding Finn, the way the wolf seemed to understand far more than any animal should. The subtle changes in the weather patterns around their property, the fact that other wildlife had begun gathering near their home, as if drawn by some invisible force. "Brigid, love," he said carefully, "your great-grandmother was a wonderful woman, but she was also known for her—" imagination. These old stories, they're just folklore, entertainment. But even as he spoke the words, Seamus found himself remembering things about his late wife that he'd pushed aside in his grief. Moira's uncanny ability to predict weather changes days in advance. The way plants flourished under her care, even in the harsh mountain climate. The stories she'd told about her family's connection to the old ways, stories he'd dismissed as charming Irish superstition. And now their daughter was standing in their backyard with a glowing crystal and a wolf that defied every law of nature. He understood. That afternoon brought an unwelcome visitor. Inspector David Walsh from the Colorado Department of Wildlife pulled into their driveway in an official vehicle, his face set in grim lines that suggested this wasn't a social call. Brigid watched from the kitchen window as the man approached their front door, her heart sinking as she recognized the authority in his bearing. Mr. O'Malley? Walsh was a tall, lean man in his 50s with prematurely grey hair and intelligent brown eyes that missed nothing. I understand you recently purchased an exotic animal. I'm here to conduct a welfare inspection. Seamus invited him in, though every instinct warned him that this man represented a threat to their newfound happiness. Walsh's credentials were legitimate, his manner professional but unyielding. He explained that the state had received reports about the wolf, concerns from citizens about public safety and animal welfare. I'll need to examine the animal and your facilities, Walsh said, pulling out an official-looking tablet. If I find that proper permits haven't been obtained or that the animal poses a risk to the community, I'm authorized to remove it immediately. Brigid felt her world tilting dangerously after everything they'd been through, after the miracle of finding Finn and discovering her family's hidden history. This stranger could simply take it all away with the stroke of a pen. They led Walsh to the backyard, where Finn was resting in the shade of an old oak tree. The wolf rose as they approached, studying the newcomer with those penetrating amber eyes. Walsh stopped several feet from the enclosure, his professional composure slipping slightly as he took in Finn's impressive size and obvious intelligence. This is unusual, he admitted, making notes on his tablet. I've never seen a wolf quite like this one. Where did you say it came from? The auction company claimed he was captured in Siberia, Seamus replied, trying to keep his voice steady. We have all the paperwork from the purchase. Walsh circled the enclosure, noting the sturdy construction and adequate space. But it was clear that his primary concern wasn't the wolf's living conditions. It was the wolf himself. Finn followed the inspector's movement with intelligent awareness, his behavior more like that of a guard dog protecting his family than a wild animal in captivity. Has he shown any signs of aggression? Walsh asked. Any attempts to escape or display territorial behavior? None at all, Brigid said quickly. He's gentle and friendly. He doesn't even eat meat, just vegetables and fruits. Walsh's eyebrows rose skeptically. A vegetarian wolf? That's highly irregular. As if responding to the doubt in the inspector's voice, Finn approached the fence where Brigid was standing. Without warning, he began to emit a low, rumbling sound that wasn't quite a growl, but wasn't like any noise either Seamus or Walsh had ever heard from an animal. The sound seemed to resonate in their chests, carrying undertones of music and meaning that made the hair on their arms stand up. But it was what happened next that truly shocked them all. Other animals began to respond to Finn's call. First came the sparrows and finches that had been gathering around their property in increasing numbers. Then rabbits emerged from the surrounding forest, followed by squirrels, chipmunks, and even a family of deer that stepped delicately into their backyard, as if attending some sort of woodland council. All of the animals positioned themselves in a rough circle around Finn's enclosure, sitting quietly and attentively, as if waiting for instruction. The wolf's amber eyes swept over his audience before settling on Walsh, and there was something unmistakably regal in his bearing, something that suggested this was no ordinary predator, but a creature accustomed to command and respect. Walsh stood, frozen, his tablet forgotten in his hand, staring at a scene that belonged in a fairy tale rather than a Colorado backyard. The animals showed no fear of each other or of the humans present, natural enemies sitting peacefully side by side, all focused on the magnificent white wolf at the center of their gathering. "This isn't possible," Walsh whispered, his scientific worldview crumbling around him. "Animals don't behave this way. They don't organize. They don't respond to interspecies communication." But as he spoke, Finn fixed him with those intelligent amber eyes, and Walsh felt something shift in his understanding of the world. There was wisdom in that gaze, ancient knowledge that predated human civilization, and a kind of patient authority that made him feel like a small child being gently corrected by a beloved teacher. The moment stretched on for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes. Then, as if some invisible signal had been given, the wild animals began to disperse, melting back into the forest as quietly as they had come. Finn settled back into his resting position, but his eyes remained fixed on the inspector with unmistakable intelligence. "I need to make some calls," Walsh said finally, his voice hoarse with shock. "There are people who need to hear about this, experts who might understand what we're dealing with here." As the inspector walked back to his vehicle, Brigid clutched her mother's pendant and felt the weight of destiny pressing down on her young shoulders. Finn was no ordinary wolf, and she was no ordinary girl. Whatever was happening to them, whatever ancient forces had brought them together, there was no going back to their simple life now. The crystal pendant pulsed with warm light against her chest, and in the distance, she could hear the sound of Finn's otherworldly call echoing through the mountains like a song of awakening. The third week brought an intensity of government attention that made Seamus's stomach churn with worry. "Inspector." Walsh had made his calls, and apparently those calls had reached the right or wrong people. Official vehicles began appearing on Maple Lane with disturbing frequency, and men in expensive suits started asking questions around town about the O'Malley family and their unusual pet. Brigid tried to maintain her normal routine, attending school and helping her father in the forge, but the stress of constant scrutiny was wearing on all of them. Even Finn seemed affected, spending more time pacing his enclosure and scanning the surrounding forest with an alertness that bordered on vigilance. It was during one of these tense afternoons that Brigid made another discovery that would change everything she thought she understood about her family's past. While helping Seamus organize tools in the forge, she'd been examining some of the older equipment that had belonged to her grandfather when her fingers brushed against something unexpected hidden beneath the leather apron hanging on the back wall. Sewn into the lining of the apron, protected by layers of heavy fabric, was a piece of parchment so old it felt like it might crumble at her touch. Carefully, she extracted the hidden document and spread it on her father's workbench. That fragment was unlike anything she'd ever seen. Drawn on what looked like animal hide with inks that had faded to sepia and gold, it showed a network of interconnected locations spanning what appeared to be the entire North American continent. Strange symbols marked each site, the same Celtic knots and spirals she'd seen in her great-grandmother's journal and on Finn's collar. "Da," she called, her voice tight with excitement. "You need to see this." Seamus emerged from the back of the forge, wiping his hands on a rag, and stopped short when he saw what Brigid had spread on his workbench. His face went pale as he recognized the parchment. "That belonged to your grandfather," he said quietly. "I remember him studying it sometimes, muttering about old responsibilities and sacred duties. I always thought it was just another piece of family folklore." Brigid traced the lines on the map with one finger, noting how they connected the various marked sites in patterns that reminded her of the energy meridians her mother had shown her in books about acupuncture. But as she studied the map more carefully, one detail made her heart skip a beat. One of the symbols sat directly over what she was almost certain was Pine Ridge. Their small mountain town, their modest cottage, their peaceful life, all of it was built on what the map clearly indicated was a sacred site of enormous importance. "Look," she whispered, pointing to the symbol. "We're living on one of them, one of the sacred places." Seamus leaned closer, squinting at the ancient markings. The symbol over Pine Ridge was larger than the others, more elaborate, surrounded by additional notations in what looked like Gaelic script. Whatever this place was, whatever its purpose in the grand design mapped out on the parchment, it was clearly significant. "That would explain a few things," he admitted, thinking about the unusual weather patterns around their property, the way wildlife had begun gathering near their home, the strange sense of energy he'd felt building in the air ever since Finn's arrival. That evening, as they sat around their kitchen table studying the map by lamplight, their contemplation was interrupted by an urgent knock at the front door. Seamus opened it to find Dr. Kennedy on their doorstep, his usually calm demeanor replaced by obvious agitation. "We need to talk," the elderly physician said, glancing around nervously. "All of us, including that wolf of yours." They gathered in the backyard under the light of a full moon, the map spread on a makeshift table constructed from sawhorses and plywood. Dr. Kennedy had brought materials of his own, old books, photocopied documents, and what looked like genealogical charts dating back several centuries. "I've been doing research since Inspector Walsh's visit," Dr. Kennedy began, adjusting his glasses in the moonlight. "The behavior we witnessed, the way the animals responded to your wolf, it reminded me of something I'd read years ago during my studies in Scotland." He opened one of the books, revealing pages of dense text interspersed with illustrations that looked remarkably similar to the symbols on their map. Celtic druids believed in sacred sites, places where the boundary between the physical and spiritual worlds was thin enough to allow communication with otherworldly forces. They stationed guardians at these sites, both human and animal, to maintain the balance and protect against dark influences. Brigid felt the crystal pendant warm against her chest as Dr. Kennedy continued his explanation. Everything he was saying aligned perfectly with what she'd read in her great-grandmother's journal, but hearing it from someone outside the family gave the information a weight and credibility that made her pulse quicken. "According to these texts," Dr. Kennedy said, turning another page, "the guardian wolves were bound to specific bloodlines through ancient rituals. They would appear in times of great need, drawn to their human counterparts by forces older than recorded history." Finn had been listening from his position near the fence, and now he rose and approached the gathered humans with obvious interest. In the moonlight, his white fur seemed to glow with its own inner radiance, and his amber eyes held depths of intelligence that were impossible to ignore. "The question," Dr. Kennedy continued, "is what kind of need would be significant enough to call a guardian wolf across continents and centuries to find a little girl in Colorado?" As if responding to the doctor's words, Finn lifted his massive head toward the sky and released another of his haunting calls, the same otherworldly sound that had so shocked Inspector Walsh. The call seemed to echo from the mountains themselves, bouncing back and forth between the peaks until it sounded like a chorus of voices singing in harmonies, too complex for human ears to fully comprehend. And from somewhere in the distance, other voices began to answer. At first, Brigid thought she was imagining things, but as the echoes died away, she could clearly hear responses coming from different directions, some from the forest to the north, others from the valleys to the east and south. Not the howls of ordinary wolves, but calls identical to Finn's, and carrying the same musical complexity and otherworldly resonance. "There are others," she whispered, her hand instinctively reaching for her father's. "There are other guardian wolves out there," Dr. Kennedy nodded grimly, "and if they're all converging on this area, something significant is about to happen, something that requires their combined presence to address." Seamus felt a chill that had nothing to do with the mountain air. His daughter's happiness, their peaceful life, the simple joy of watching Brigid bond with her unusual companion, All of it was apparently just the prelude to something much larger and more dangerous than he'd ever imagined. The map on their makeshift table seemed to glow in the moonlight, its network of connected sites taking on an ominous significance. If Pine Ridge was indeed a major node in some ancient protective system, and if that system was somehow activating, after lying dormant for generations, then what kind of threat could be serious enough to trigger such a response? Finn's amber eyes met Brigid's through the fence, and in that gaze she saw both promise and warning. Whatever was coming, whatever role she was meant to play in the unfolding drama, her guardian wolf would be beside her every step of the way. But as more calls echoed through the night from the surrounding mountains, Brigid couldn't shake the feeling that their quiet life in Pine Ridge was about to end forever. By the fourth week, Pine Ridge had become the center of activity that defied explanation. Government vehicles were no longer an occasional sight, but a constant presence, their occupants conducting what they termed environmental surveys and geological assessments. The townspeople whispered among themselves about the sudden interest in their quiet mountain community, but none of them suspected the truth about what was really drawing such attention to their remote corner of Colorado. Brigid had grown accustomed to the weight of secrets she carried. The crystal pendant never left her neck now, hidden beneath her sweaters, but always warm against her skin. Her great-grandmother's journal had become her constant companion, and she'd memorized entire passages about guardian rituals and sacred sites. Most importantly, her connection with Finn had deepened to the point where she sometimes felt she could sense his emotions and thoughts as clearly as her own. It was during one of her late-night reading sessions that she made perhaps her most significant discovery yet. Hidden in a passage written entirely in Gaelic, which she'd been slowly translating using an old dictionary from the library, she found reference to something called the Ritual Stone, a communication device that would allow direct contact with the ancestral spirits who had originally established the Guardian network. The description of the stone matched something she remembered seeing in their old root cellar years ago when she'd been playing hide-and-seek with her mother. At the time, she'd thought it was just an oddly shaped rock, but according to the journal, the ritual stone would be smooth black granite carved with Celtic knots, about the size of a dinner plate and imbued with enough spiritual energy to serve as a conduit between worlds. That weekend, while Seamus was busy dealing with yet another visit from government officials, Brigid made her way to the root cellar behind their house. The underground storage space hadn't been used much since her mother's death. Seamus preferred to buy groceries weekly rather than maintain the preserve jars and stored vegetables that Moira had lovingly tended. The cellar was dark and musty, filled with the ghost scents of apples and root vegetables from better times. Brigid used her phone's flashlight to navigate between the empty shelves until she found what she was looking for in the farthest corner, half hidden behind a stack of unused mason jars. The stone was exactly as the journal had described. Smooth, black granite carved with intricate Celtic knotwork that seemed to shift and flow in the beam of her flashlight. When she touched its surface, warmth spread up her arms, and she could swear she heard faint whispers in a language she didn't recognize but somehow understood. That evening, she brought the stone to Finn's enclosure. The moment the wolf saw what she carried, his entire demeanor changed. He rose to his full, impressive height and approached the fence with an alertness that bordered on reverence. The ancient collar around his neck began to glow with the same soft light as Brigid's pendant, and the stone itself seemed to pulse with inner fire. Following instructions from the journal, Brigid placed her hands on the stone's carved surface and closed her eyes, opening her mind to whatever communication the artifact might facilitate. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then gradually, she became aware of a presence that was both foreign and familiar, ancient beyond imagining, yet warm with maternal love. Brigid, child of my line. The voice seemed to come from the stone itself, resonating in her bones rather than her ears. I have waited so long to speak with you, mother. Brigid whispered, though she knew immediately that this wasn't Moira's spirit. This presence was older, more elemental, carrying the weight of centuries and the wisdom of ages. I am Siobhan, your great-grandmother, keeper of the old ways and guardian of the sacred knowledge. Through this stone, I can bridge the gap between worlds to guide you in what is to come. Tears streamed down Brigid's face as she felt the overwhelming love and pride flowing from the ancient spirit. I don't understand what's happening to us. Why did Finn come to me? Why are all these government people suddenly interested in Pine Ridge? The network is awakening, child. The sacred sites that have slept for generations are stirring to life because a great darkness approaches. The same forces that once threatened the old world have found a way into this new one, and they seek to corrupt the very foundations of reality itself. Through the stone, Brigid began to see images, flashes of vision that showed her glimpses of events unfolding beyond her ordinary perception. She saw men in expensive suits conducting rituals in underground chambers, their ceremonies designed not to honor the sacred places, but to corrupt them. She saw darkness spreading like a plague across the network of sites, turning protective energy into destructive force. The corporation that claims to be conducting geological surveys, Siobhan's voice continued, they are servants of the dark forces. They seek to breach the barriers at Pine Ridge, to use your sacred site as a gateway for powers that should never be allowed into this realm. But I'm just a little girl, Brigid protested, her voice breaking with the weight of responsibility. She could feel settling on her shoulders. How can I stop something like that? You are no ordinary child, Brigid O'Malley. You are the last of the Guardian bloodline in this region, and Finn is the last of the Guardian wolves. Together, you represent the only hope of maintaining the barriers that protect not just Pine Ridge, but the entire world from the chaos that would follow their collapse. Finn pressed against the fence, his amber eyes fixed on Brigid with an intensity that made her feel both protected and profoundly humbled. Through her connection with the stone, she could sense the wolf's ancient memories, centuries of guardianship, battles fought against forces of darkness, the loneliness of being the last of his kind until he found his way to her. What do I need to do? She asked, though part of her already knew the answer would change her life forever. You must accept your role as guardian of Pine Ridge. The ritual must be completed during the next new moon, when the boundaries between worlds are thinnest. Only then will you and Finn be able to access the full power needed to repel the coming attack. My father, your father carries the bloodline through his marriage to your mother, but the responsibility passes to you now. He will understand in time, as will the others who are destined to help you, the doctor, the shopkeeper, even the priest who serves your community. The old blood calls to its own, and when the moment comes, they will remember their part in the ancient covenant. The connection began to fade, the stone's glow dimming as Siobhan's presence withdrew. But her final words echoed clearly in Brigid's mind. Trust in Finn, trust in yourself, and remember that love is the greatest weapon against darkness. Your mother's sacrifice was not in vain. She died protecting the knowledge that would one day save us all. As the stone returned to its inert state, Brigid found herself sitting in her backyard, with tears streaming down her face and a weight of destiny pressing against her chest like a physical thing. Finn watched her through the fence with eyes full of ancient patience and unconditional love, and she knew that whatever came next, she wouldn't face it alone. From somewhere in the distance, she could hear the rumble of heavy machinery. The corporate survey team was working late again, their activities growing more aggressive and invasive with each passing day. According to Siobhan's warning, they weren't just studying the geological features of Pine Ridge. They were actively working to breach the protective barriers that had kept the darkness at bay for generations. Time was running out, and a 9-year-old girl with a mystical wolf was apparently the world's last hope of stopping an ancient evil from breaking free. Into the modern age, The revelation came on a Thursday morning that started like any other, but would end with Brigid's understanding of everything turned completely upside down. Inspector Walsh had returned to Pine Ridge, but this time he came alone, without the official vehicle and government credentials that had marked his previous visits. Instead, he stood on their front porch at dawn, looking haggard and desperate, with the manner of a man who had been wrestling with terrible knowledge and losing the battle. "I need to speak with you," he said when Seamus answered the door. "All of you. About what's really happening here, about who I really am, and about why your daughter is in more danger than you can possibly imagine." They gathered around the kitchen table as they had so many times before, but the atmosphere was charged with tension and foreboding. Walsh looked older than he had just weeks ago, as if the weight of secrets had aged him prematurely. When he began to speak, his voice carried the hollow tone of a man confessing his sins. "My real name is David Walsh, but I'm not just a wildlife inspector. I'm Moira's brother, your wife's younger brother Seamus, Brigid's uncle." The silence that followed was deafening. Brigid stared at this stranger who claimed to be family, searching his features for any resemblance to her mother. Now that she looked for it, she could see similarities in the shape of his eyes, the line of his jaw, the way he held his hands when he was thinking. "That's impossible," Seamus said, his voice tight with disbelief. "Moira never mentioned having a brother. Her family died when she was young. That's what she told you, because that's what I made her promise to tell you," Walsh interrupted, his composure cracking. 20 years ago, I made the biggest mistake of my life. I believed that I could prevent a catastrophe by keeping our family separated, by hiding from the responsibilities that our bloodline carried. I was wrong about everything." He pulled a leather portfolio from his jacket and spread its contents on the table. Ancient documents, genealogical charts, and what looked like official government files created a mosaic of evidence that painted a picture Brigid was only beginning to understand. "The O'Reilly family, your mother's maiden name. We are direct descendants of the Celtic Guardians who established the Sacred Site Network centuries ago. The responsibility of maintaining the barriers, of protecting the sacred places, it passes through our bloodline. But 20 years ago, I convinced myself that the old ways were superstition, that the modern world had no place for ancient magic and mystical responsibilities." Brigid felt the crystal pendant grow warm against her chest as Walsh continued his explanation. Everything he was saying aligned with what she'd learned from her great-grandmother's journal and her communication with Siobhan's spirit, but hearing it from someone who had actually lived through the consequences of abandoning those responsibilities gave it a horrible immediacy. "There was a prophecy," Walsh said, his voice barely above a whisper, "a blood moon prophecy that spoke of a time when the Guardian and the Wolf would either unite to save the world or be separated to destroy it. The ancient texts were unclear about which outcome would occur, but they were explicit about the consequences of preventing the union. If the Guardian and the Wolf were kept apart, if the sacred sites were left unprotected, then the barriers between worlds would collapse and an ancient evil would be released into our reality. But you tried to prevent it anyway," Seamus said, understanding beginning to dawn in his expression. "I thought I was saving the world," Walsh replied, his hands shaking as he turned pages in the ancient documents. "I believed that if I kept our family away from Pine Ridge, if I prevented Moira from fulfilling her role as guardian, then the prophecy couldn't be fulfilled and the potential catastrophe could be avoided. I used my position with the government to monitor the sacred sites, to ensure that nothing supernatural was occurring, to maintain what I thought was a safer status quo." "What happened to my mother?" Brigid asked, her voice small but determined. "The cancer, was that real?" Walsh's face crumpled with grief and guilt. "The cancer was real, but it wasn't natural. When a guardian abandons their post, when they turn their back on the sacred responsibilities, the magic turns inward. It becomes a poison that destroys from within. Your mother died because I convinced her to abandon her destiny, because I made her believe that ignoring the old ways would keep her family safe. The implications hit Brigid like a physical blow. Her mother hadn't died from random misfortune or genetic predisposition. She died because her brother had convinced her to abandon the very purpose for which she'd been born. And now, 20 years later, the consequences of that decision were threatening to destroy everything. The corporate survey team, Brigid said, pieces of the puzzle clicking into place in her mind. They're not really conducting geological research, are they? They work for an organization that has been seeking access to the sacred sites for over a century, Walsh confirmed. When I realized that the barriers were beginning to fail because of the Guardian's absence, when I understood that my attempts to prevent the prophecy had actually set it in motion, I tried to stop them. But I was too late. They'd already identified Pine Ridge as the primary node in the network, the key site that controls all the others. He pulled out a final document, this one bearing official government seals and classification markings. This is the real reason I came here initially. Not to remove your wolf, but to confirm what I already suspected, that the prophecy was finally beginning to fulfill itself. Finn's appearance, your daughter's obvious connection to the Guardian bloodline, the awakening of the sacred site. It was all exactly what the ancient texts predicted. So what happens now? Seamus asked, though he wasn't entirely sure he wanted to hear the answer. Now, we have less than a week to prepare for the final confrontation, Walsh said, his voice carrying the weight of absolute certainty. The blood moon occurs next Friday. That's when the barriers will be at their weakest, when the corporate organization will make their final attempt to breach the sacred site. And that's when Brigid and Finn will either succeed in their role as guardians or fail and watch the world fall to darkness. Brigid stood up from the table and walked to the kitchen window that overlooked Finn's enclosure. The wolf was already watching her, those amber eyes full of ancient knowledge and patient strength. As she looked at him, she felt the full weight of her destiny settling around her like a cloak. She was 9 years old, but she was also the last guardian of an ancient bloodline. She was a little girl who had just lost her mother 2 years ago. But she was also humanity's final hope against forces that had been plotting their return for centuries. She was terrified and overwhelmed, but she was also filled with a strength that came from somewhere deeper than her own young heart. "Uncle David," she said, using the familial title for the first time, "will you help us? Will you help me learn what I need to know to protect everyone?" Walsh's eyes filled with tears as he heard her acceptance of the impossible burden that should never have fallen on such young shoulders. "Yes," he said simply, "I'll help you undo the damage I caused. I'll help you become the guardian your mother should have been allowed to be." Outside the window, Finn raised his massive head toward the morning sky and released one of his haunting calls. This time, the response came not just from the distant mountains, but from much closer, from the forest, just beyond their property line. The other guardian wolves were gathering, drawn by the approaching convergence of fate and destiny. The blood moon was 6 days away, and the final battle for the soul of the world was about to begin in a small mountain town where a brave little girl and her mystical wolf would either save everything or watch it all fall to darkness. But for the first time since this all began, Brigid no longer felt alone. She had her father, her wolf, and now an uncle who understood the true magnitude of what they faced. Whatever came next, they would face it together, as the ancient guardians had always been meant to do. 3 days before the blood moon, Pine Ridge transformed from a quiet mountain community into the staging ground for a battle between forces that most of the world didn't even know existed. The corporate survey team had abandoned all pretense of legitimate research, bringing in heavy equipment and armed personnel under the cover of "the staff chooses its bearer," Walsh said quietly, his voice filled with awe and trepidation. "That hasn't been seen for over 300 years. The last guardian to carry one died defending Edinburgh from supernatural invasion in 1692. Brigid lifted the staff, feeling its weight, not just physical, but spiritual. Through its crystal tip, she could see energy lines crisscrossing the landscape around Pine Ridge like a vast web of light. The sacred site beneath their town pulsed like a heart, sending protective energy along these pathways to dozens of other locations across the continent. But she could also see the dark spots where that energy was being corrupted, places where the corporate organization had successfully breached the barriers. "How many other sacred sites have they compromised?" she asked, though she wasn't sure. She wanted to hear the answer. 7 so far, Walsh replied, consulting his notes. Seattle, Denver, Phoenix, Chicago, Atlanta, Boston, and Miami. Each breach weakens the entire network, makes it easier for them to corrupt the next site. Pine Ridge is the hub. If they succeed here, every remaining sacred site in North America will fall within hours. That evening, the townspeople began gathering at the O'Malley cottage without any formal invitation or explanation. They came as if called by some instinct they didn't fully understand, carrying food for a potluck dinner that turned into something much more significant. Mrs. Flanagan arrived first, her arms full of warm bread and her eyes bright with knowledge. She'd clearly been hiding for years. "I've been waiting my whole life for this night," she told Brigid, pulling the girl into a fierce hug. "My grandmother told me stories about the guardian families, about the day when the old responsibilities would need to be taken up again. Father Murphy came next, carrying not his usual Bible, but an ancient leather tome bound with iron clasps. The church has been keeping certain records safe for centuries," he explained to Walsh's surprised look. "We always knew this day would come." Dr. Kennedy brought medical supplies, but also something more precious, genealogical charts that traced the bloodlines of half the families in Pine Ridge back to Celtic origins. "We're all connected," he said, spreading the charts on their kitchen table. "Most of us carry some trace of the Guardian heritage. When the time comes, we'll all feel the call to help." As the evening progressed, more neighbors arrived. The Hendersons from down the road, the McKinneys who ran the gas station, even old Mr. Peterson, who rarely left his remote cabin. All of them seemed to understand that something momentous was approaching, that their quiet mountain community was about to become the center of a battle for the future of the world. Finn watched the gathering from his enclosure with obvious approval, his amber eyes tracking each arrival with the satisfaction of a general reviewing his troops. Other wolves had been spotted in the surrounding forest throughout the day. Not ordinary wolves, but creatures like Finn, guardians who had somehow survived the centuries and were now converging on Pine Ridge for the final confrontation. "How many guardian wolves are out there?" Brigid asked Walsh as they watched a magnificent grey shape move through the trees beyond their property line. "We've identified at least 12, Walsh replied. "Finn was never actually the last of his kind, just the last one free to act. The others have been bound by various circumstances, waiting for the moment when a true guardian would appear to lead them." As night fell, the corporate organization's activities reached a new level of intensity. Spotlights blazed throughout the valley, and the sound of heavy machinery echoed off the mountain walls. They were no longer even attempting to hide their true purpose, bringing in equipment that looked more suitable for military operations than geological surveys. "They'll make their move tomorrow night," Walsh said, studying intelligence reports. He'd gathered from his contacts in various government agencies. During the blood moon, when the barriers are weakest, they're planning to use a combination of high-tech equipment and dark rituals to shatter the protective ward around Pine Ridge. "What kind of dark rituals?" Seamus asked, though his expression suggested he might prefer not to know. "The same ones that destroyed Atlantis, that brought down the Library of Alexandria, that turned fertile lands into deserts and poisoned rivers for generations," Walsh replied grimly. "They're going to try to invert the sacred site's energy, turn it from a source of protection into a gateway for entities that were banished from this reality millennia ago. Brigid felt a chill that had nothing to do with the mountain air. Through her connection with the Guardian network, she could sense the malevolent presence that lurked just beyond the barriers, ancient intelligences that viewed humanity as nothing, more than cattle to be harvested for their own dark purposes. "But we're going to stop them," she said. And though her voice was that of a 9-year-old girl, it carried authority that made every adult in the room stand a little straighter. The final preparations began that night. Mrs. Flanagan revealed that she had been the keeper of certain protective charms and blessed items, artifacts her grandmother had hidden decades ago, with instructions to bring them forth when the Guardian returned. Father Murphy began consecrating the ground around the cottage and the sacred site, using rituals that predated Christianity but had been carefully preserved by enlightened members of the church. Dr. Kennedy organized the medical station that would treat wounded after the battle, while also preparing the scientific instruments that might help them understand and counter the corporate organization's technology. The other townspeople took up positions around the perimeter, armed not just with conventional weapons, but with blessed items and protective talismans that had been passed down through generations. Seamus spent the night in his forge, working, with an intensity Brigid had never seen from him before. He was crafting weapons, not ordinary blades, but implements imbued with the same protective energy that flowed through the sacred site. Each piece he created was a work of art that hummed, with power, designed to channel and focus the Guardian energy that would be crucial in the coming battle. "Your grandfather taught me more than just blacksmithing," he explained to Brigid as she watched him work. He knew this day would come, knew that the old skills would be needed again. Every technique he showed me, every song he hummed while working, every blessing he spoke over the metal, it was all preparation for tonight. As dawn approached on the final day, Brigid stood in her backyard with the Guardian's staff in her hands and Finn at her side, looking out over a town that had been transformed by the approaching battle. The corporate organization's equipment formed a ring around Pine Ridge, their excavations and installations designed to channel and corrupt the sacred energy. But the townspeople had created their own defensive positions, blessed ground and protective wards that would serve as the first line of defense against the coming assault. "Are you ready?" Walsh asked, joining her at the window. Brigid looked at the staff in her hands, felt the crystal pendant warm against her chest, and sensed the vast network of energy that connected her to sacred sites around the world. She was 9 years old, but she carried the power and knowledge of countless generations of Guardians. She was afraid, but she was not alone. "Yes," she said simply, "we're ready." The blood moon would rise in 12 hours, and with it would come the final test of everything she'd learned, everything she'd become, and everything she was willing to sacrifice to protect the world from an ancient darkness that had been waiting centuries for this moment of vulnerability. But as she stood there with her wolf beside her and her community rallying to her defense, Brigid O'Malley felt something she hadn't experienced since her mother's death. Absolute certainty that she was exactly where she needed to be, doing exactly what she was born to do. Security assessment. Their activities had grown increasingly aggressive, with deep excavations around the town's perimeter and strange electromagnetic readings that made electronic devices malfunction throughout the valley. But they weren't the only ones preparing for what was to come. Under Walsh's guidance, Brigid had begun undergoing the most intensive and extraordinary training of her young life. Each morning before school, she worked with the ritual stone to deepen her connection to the ancestral spirits, learning to channel the ancient knowledge that flowed through her bloodline. Each afternoon, she practiced with the crystal pendant, learning to focus and direct the mystical energy that was her birthright as a guardian. Most importantly, her bond with Finn had evolved beyond anything that could be called a normal relationship between human and animal. They could communicate now without words, sharing thoughts and emotions with an intimacy that transcended species. When she placed her hand on his massive head, she could see through his eyes, feel through his senses, access memories that stretched back through centuries of guardian partnerships. It was during one of these shared experiences that Brigid witnessed the materialization of something that would become crucial to the coming battle. As her consciousness merged with Finn's ancient memories, she felt a familiar warmth spread through her body, centering in her chest where her mother's pendant rested. When she opened her eyes, she was holding something that hadn't been there. Moments before, the Guardian's staff was a thing of impossible beauty, carved from wood that seemed to contain starlight and topped with a crystal that pulsed in harmony with her own pendant. It was perfectly sized for her small hands, yet she could sense that it contained power enough to level mountains or heal the deepest wounds. The moment her fingers closed around its smooth surface, knowledge flooded her mind. Knowledge of how to use it, when to use it, and what sacrifices it might demand of her. The blood moon began its ascent over Pine Ridge at precisely 8:47 p.m., casting the snow-covered mountains in an otherworldly crimson glow that made even familiar landmarks look alien and threatening. Brigid stood at her bedroom window, the Guardian's staff humming with barely contained power in her small hands, watching as the corporate organization's final assault began. Their equipment had been positioned in a perfect circle around the town, each installation connected by cables that sparked with unnatural energy. At the center of their operation, in what had once been the town's baseball field, they had erected a metallic structure that hurt to look at directly, angles that seemed to bend space around them, surfaces that reflected not light but darkness itself. "They're beginning the ritual," Walsh said grimly, joining her at the window. Through his binoculars, he could see figures in dark robes gathering around the central structure, their movements following patterns that had nothing to do with any earthly ceremony. Finn let out a low growl from the backyard, and immediately the sound was answered by howls from the forest. The Guardian wolves were taking their positions, forming their own protective circle around the sacred site beneath. The O'Malley cottage. Through her mystical connection, Brigid could sense each of them. 12 magnificent creatures whose combined presence created a network of supernatural awareness that covered every approach to their home. The first wave of the assault came not as physical attack, but as psychological warfare. A crushing sense of despair began to settle over Pine Ridge like a suffocating blanket, carrying whispers in languages that predated human speech. The townspeople who had volunteered to help defend the sacred site suddenly found themselves questioning their resolve, remembering every failure and regret from their lives, feeling the weight of hopelessness pressing down on their souls. But Brigid was ready for this. Lifting the Guardian's staff, she channeled energy not just from the crystal at its tip, but from every protective ward, every blessed item, every prayer that had been spoken over Pine Ridge throughout the evening. The staff blazed with pure white, light that cut through the artificial despair like a sword through shadow, restoring hope and determination to her defenders. "First test passed," Walsh muttered, but his relief was short-lived. The corporate organization had been prepared for spiritual resistance, and their response was swift and overwhelming. The ground around Pine Ridge began to tremble as their machines activated, sending shock waves through the sacred site that made Brigid's teeth ache and caused her crystal pendant to pulse erratically. Through her connection to the Guardian network, she could feel the protective barriers that had held for centuries beginning to strain under the assault. "They're trying to crack the foundation," she said, understanding flooding through her as ancestral knowledge activated in response to the threat. "If they can shatter the bedrock beneath the sacred site, they can corrupt the energy at its source." Finn appeared at the back door, having somehow managed to open the latch with his powerful jaws. His amber eyes blazed with supernatural fire. As he padded through the house to stand beside Brigid, his massive presence immediately doubling her sense of strength and purpose. The second wave of attack came as a direct assault on the cottage itself. Dark figures emerged from the corporate organization's positions, moving with inhuman speed and grace toward the O'Malley property. These weren't ordinary mercenaries, but something far more dangerous, humans who had been changed by their contact. With the entities beyond the barriers twisted into hybrid creatures that combined human intelligence with otherworldly malevolence. The townspeople opened fire from their defensive positions, but their bullets seemed to have little effect on the attacking creatures. It wasn't until Father Murphy began chanting in Latin, his ancient tome glowing with holy light, that the first of the attackers stumbled and fell, his inhuman shriek echoing across the valley. "Blessed weapons only," Dr. Kennedy called out, distributing the sanctified ammunition that Mrs. Flanagan had prepared, according to instructions, passed down from her grandmother. "Regular bullets won't stop them." Brigid gripped the Guardian's staff more tightly and stepped outside onto the back porch, Finn moving to position himself between her and the approaching threat. She could see at least 20 of the hybrid creatures, advancing on their position, their movements eerily coordinated, as they flowed through the defending townspeople like water around stones. But as they drew closer to the cottage, something extraordinary happened. The sacred site beneath their feet began to respond to her presence, sending up pillars of pure energy that formed a protective barrier around the property. The attacking creatures slammed into this barrier and rebounded as if they had struck solid stone, their inhuman cries of frustration and pain echoing through the night. "The heart of the mountain," Brigid whispered, understanding dawning in her mind. Deep beneath Pine Ridge, at the very core of the sacred site, lay a massive crystal formation that served as the power source for the entire Continental Guardian network. The corporate organization's machines were trying to reach it, to corrupt it. But first, they had to get past her. Finn threw back his head and howled, a sound that seemed to shake the very foundations of the mountain. The other Guardian wolves answered from their positions around the town, their combined voices creating a harmony that made the attacking creatures cower, and the blood moon itself seemed to pulse in rhythm. The real battle was just beginning. As the blood moon reached its zenith, the true magnitude of what they faced became terrifyingly clear. The corporate organization's leader emerged from the central structure in the baseball field, and he was no longer entirely human. Dark energy swirled around him like living smoke, and when he spoke, his voice carried harmonics that seemed to come from multiple throats at once. "Guardian child," he called across the battlefield, his words somehow reaching Brigid despite the distance. "And chaos. You cannot hold back the inevitable. The old age is ending, and the new darkness will consume everything you seek to protect." But even as he spoke, Brigid felt Finn's strength flowing into her through their mystical bond, followed by something even more powerful, the presence of her mother's spirit, somehow channeled through the crystal pendant that had once been Moira's. "Most treasured possession, my darling girl," her mother's voice whispered in her mind, as clear and loving as if she were standing right beside her. "I never left you. I've been waiting in the space between worlds, gathering strength for this moment." The pendant blazed with sudden radiance, and Brigid felt her power multiply exponentially, but with that increase came terrible understanding. To access the full strength of the Guardian bloodline, to channel enough energy to defeat the forces, a raid against them would require a sacrifice that might cost her everything. "I know what you're thinking," Moira's spirit continued, "but there is another way. Love, not sacrifice, is the true weapon against darkness. Trust in the bond you've forged with Finn, trust in the community that stands with you, and trust in the power that flows from connection rather than destruction." Around the perimeter of their property, the hybrid creatures were regrouping for another assault, but now they were joined by something far worse. The central structure in the baseball field was beginning to tear a hole in reality itself, and through that growing rift came glimpses of the entities that had been banished from this world millennia ago. Things of shadow and hunger that had been waiting eons for the chance to return. Finn suddenly stiffened beside her, his amber eyes fixing on something in the distance that made his hackles rise. Through their shared senses, Brigid saw what had alarmed him. The corporate leader was beginning a ritual that would sacrifice the corrupted sacred sites to fuel a massive expansion of the dimensional rift. He's going to use the energy from the compromised sites to tear open a permanent gateway, she realized, horror flooding through her. Once that portal stabilizes, there won't be any way to stop what comes through. But as she spoke, a golden light began to emanate from both her pendant and Finn's collar, spreading outward to encompass not just their property, but the entire town. Everywhere the light touched, the artificial despair and supernatural fear that had been clouding people's minds began to lift, replaced by a sense of unity and shared purpose that transcended individual concerns. Mrs. Flanagan stepped forward. From her defensive position, her weathered hands glowing with the same golden radiance. "I remember now," she said, her voice carrying clearly across the battlefield. "My grandmother taught me the old songs, the ones that could weave protection around an entire community." Father Murphy joined her, his ancient tome open to pages that hadn't been read in centuries, adding his voice to hers in harmonies that seemed to strengthen the very fabric of reality. Dr. Kennedy came next, then the Hendersons, then every defender who had chosen to stand with them against the darkness. The song that rose from Pine Ridge that night was unlike anything that had been heard in the modern world, a chorus of human voices united in purpose, channeling power that came not from individual strength, but from the collective will to protect what they loved. The golden light intensified, forming a dome of protection that encompassed the entire town, and began pushing back against the corporate organization's assault. The hybrid creatures attacking their perimeter suddenly found themselves unable to advance, repelled not by violence, but by an overwhelming sense of belonging and acceptance that was antithetical to their corrupted nature. Several of them actually began to change, their inhuman features softening as whatever remained of their original humanity responded to the song of connection and love. But the corporate leader was not so easily deterred. Abandoning his attempt to open the dimensional rift gradually, he began pouring all of his accumulated dark energy into one final catastrophic assault on the sacred site's heart. The mountain beneath Pine Ridge shuddered as unnatural force met ancient protection, and Brigid felt the Guardian network strain under pressure that threatened to shatter it entirely. "Now," Moira's spirit whispered urgently, "while he's fully committed to the attack, while his defenses are lowered, this is your moment." Brigid looked at Finn, seeing in his amber eyes the same understanding that filled her own heart. Together, they represented something the forces of darkness had never faced before. Not a guardian fighting alone against overwhelming odds, but a partnership built on absolute trust and unconditional love. As one, girl and wolf stepped forward into the golden light, ready to face whatever came next, with the knowledge that they would never face it alone. The battle for the soul of the world was about to reach its climax, and everything would depend on whether love truly was stronger than the oldest darkness. 3 months after the night that changed everything, Pine Ridge had settled into a new kind of normal, one where the extraordinary had become part of daily life, and where a young girl and her wolf were recognized as the protectors of something far more precious than anyone had ever imagined. The corporate organization's equipment had been removed by a joint task force comprising agencies that most people had never heard of, their personnel either arrested or quietly transferred to facilities where they could receive the kind of help needed by those who had been touched by other worldly forces. The dimensional rift had been sealed, The corrupted sacred sites had been cleansed and restored, and the Guardian network hummed with renewed strength across the entire continent. Inspector Walsh, Uncle David, as Brigid now called him, had taken up permanent residence in Pine Ridge, accepting the role of official liaison between the mystical and mundane worlds that his government contacts had offered him. His 20 years of guilt had transformed into 20 years of experience that proved invaluable in helping other communities understand and protect their own sacred sites. The network is stronger now than it's been in over 2 centuries, he explained to a gathering of newly awakened guardians who had come to Pine Ridge to learn from Brigid and Finn. When one site is threatened, the others can provide support. When new guardians emerge, they have mentors to guide them. The isolation that weakened us for so long is finally ending. Brigid had grown in the months since the Blood Moon battle, not just in height and confidence, but in her understanding of the responsibilities she carried. The Guardian's staff had become as natural to her as her own hands, and her connection with Finn had deepened to the point where they often seemed to share a single consciousness. But perhaps most importantly, she had learned to balance her mystical duties with the normal life of a 10-year-old girl. School had resumed with some significant changes. Miss O'Brien had quietly added local history and Celtic traditions to the curriculum, and several new families had moved to Pine Ridge, people who carried traces of the old bloodlines and felt called to help maintain the sacred site. The town's population had nearly doubled, but it retained its close-knit character, unified by the shared knowledge of what they had defended together. Mrs. Flanagan had transformed her general store into something resembling a mystical supply shop, though she was careful to present the protective charms and blessed items as traditional crafts and folk art to visitors who weren't part of the Guardian community. Her grandmother's recipes for protective potions had been adapted into herbal teas and natural remedies that actually worked better than anyone expected. Father Murphy had become something of a scholar of comparative religion, working with religious leaders from various traditions to document and preserve the spiritual practices that supported the sacred sites. The little Catholic church in Pine Ridge now hosted interfaith services that drew visitors from hundreds of miles away, though most of them never suspected the true purpose of the ceremonies they witnessed. Dr. Kennedy had established what he called a holistic medical research facility that attracted both conventional physicians and practitioners of alternative healing arts. His work documenting the health benefits of proximity to sacred sites had begun to influence medical practices across the region, though he was careful to frame his findings in terms that wouldn't trigger skepticism from the mainstream medical community. Seamus had expanded his forge into a workshop that produced both practical ironwork and mystical implements for the growing Guardian community. His reputation for crafting blessed weapons and protective items had spread throughout the network, and he often found himself working with materials that would have seemed impossible just months before. Metals that held starlight, wood that sang with its own voice, crystals that pulsed with heartbeats of their own. But perhaps the most significant change was in the relationship between human and mystical communities throughout the region. The Guardian wolves were no longer solitary creatures hiding in the wilderness, but acknowledged partners in maintaining the balance between worlds. Several other families in the area had formed bonds with supernatural guardians, not all wolves, but various creatures of legend that had emerged from hiding when the network awakened. On a warm spring afternoon, exactly 3 months after the Blood Moon battle, Brigid sat on her front porch with Finn beside her, watching the sun set over mountains that now sparkled with subtle energy, visible only to those who knew how to look for it. The memorial stone they had erected in the town square caught the evening light, its inscription simple but profound. In memory of all guardians who served before us, in honor of those who serve today, and in hope for those who will carry the light forward. "Do you think we did the right thing?" she asked Finn, speaking aloud, though she knew he could sense her thoughts as clearly as her words. "Accepting all this responsibility, changing so many lives." Finn's amber eyes met hers with that familiar expression of ancient wisdom and infinite patience. Through their bond, she felt his response, not words, but pure understanding. They had been given a gift and a burden, but most importantly, they had been given each other. The loneliness that had once defined both their lives had been transformed into connection, not just between them, but between their community and the wider world of wonder that most people never glimpsed. A movement in the distance caught her attention, and Brigid smiled as she saw a familiar figure walking up their gravel drive. Her friend Sarah from school, one of the new students whose family had moved to Pine Ridge after the awakening, was carrying a small bundle that seemed to glow with its own inner light. "My grandmother sent this for you," Sarah said shyly, offering the bundle to Brigid. "She said you'd know what to do with it." Inside, the cloth wrapping was a crystal unlike any Brigid had seen before, not Celtic in design, but bearing symbols that spoke of different traditions, different ways of connecting to the same underlying network of sacred energy. As she held it, she could sense other communities awakening around the world, other guardians beginning to understand their roles in the great tapestry of protection that spanned continents and cultures. The work was far from over. If anything, the successful defense of Pine Ridge had marked the beginning of a new age of cooperation between the mystical and mundane worlds. There would be other threats, other battles, other moments when the fate of everything would hang in the balance. But as Brigid sat on her porch with Finn at her side, surrounded by the community that had become her extended family, she felt something she hadn't experienced since before her mother's death. Absolute certainty that she was exactly where she belonged, doing exactly what she was meant to do. The lonely girl, who had once dreamed of a companion, had become the guardian of an entire world, and the wolf who had waited centuries for his partner had found not just a human to protect, but a family to love. Together, they watched over Pine Ridge as the first stars appeared in the darkening sky, ready for whatever tomorrow might bring.